When our speaker last spoke to our chapter in 2018, he addressed the situation in Afghanistan, accurately predicting the difficulties we would face in light of the shameful corruption of the Afghan government and a failure to win the hearts and minds of so many Afghans. And here, 4 years later, we face another major challenge. Thank you. And with this new challenge and the exponential growth of disinformation, the free press face a crisis of confidence from the public when the need for reliable, insightful, and balanced reporting has never been ever greater. Our country is politically divided, and our perceptions of the media are unfortunately equally divided. And without accurate information, it is increasingly difficult to discern truth from fiction. And it is no easy task to extract accurate information where freedom of the press is absent. And no greater example of this today is the Russian war on Ukraine and Putin's draconian actions against the opposition press within his country. 2 journalists were killed this week, which just remind us of that there is a price to be paid for a free press. Our guest speaker tonight is no stranger to the hazards of dangers of reporting from conflict zones throughout the world. He is a highly respected and gifted journalist, as is his wife, Jan. Tim began his career in journalism as a foreign correspondent for Time magazine, writing a number of critically important cover stories. He is past recipient of the Henry Luce Award for reporting and received the Foreign Press Association Story of the Year Award for reporting in Iraq. Tim taught international reporting at Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. It's a fantastic program, probably one of the best in the world, and was managing editor of their investigative reporting program. So please give a warm welcome to and return to Tim McGirk.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here once again. I had such a great time when you guys invited me here 4 years ago, and I was, and after teaching students, and even though they were graduate students, it was just such a pleasure to be around people who are so well informed and so well traveled. I mean, before and afterwards, I got into such good conversations with all of you that when Bill and Frank asked me to come back again, I was happy to do so. And I started out, started out thinking, well, maybe a good topic of discussion would be, as Bill was saying, to look at just how hyper-partisan the press has become here in the United States. And but then the tragic events happened in Ukraine, and I thought that this would be really a good example to talk about something that's kind of occupying all of our minds and engaging us in a way that that distant conflicts really haven't in the past. And so what I really wanted to look about, first of all, a disclaimer, I know nothing about Ukraine or about Russia, and it sounds like you've got people coming who will speak with great authority on the subject, but I do know something about the way the press works and information and disinformation. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about is just kind of the pressures that that journalists and the press are under in a wartime situation, and especially as it refers to Ukraine and Russia. And what I want to do is that to pick up on that old adage that I'm sure you've all heard about truth being the first casualty of war. Mm-hmm. And sadly, it was true back in the time of the Greeks, and it's true here today, and we're seeing it very much so in the reporting that's going on about this whole conflict in Ukraine. And so let's take kind of the low-lying fruit. Let's look at what the Russians are doing. And I'm saying that before we get into it, I'd like to point out that what I hope to talk about a little bit is just that there's any reporting that goes on of a war, in a war situation, that there's a certain amount of distortion that occurs in the way that stories get reported. So I think it's crucial to understand these distortions as we're looking at the war, at the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. So, let's start with the Russians, and it's kind of, I guess, blatantly obvious that what's going on in Russia, that what we're seeing is that the veneer of what appeared to be an open society is being stripped away, ripped away, and what we're seeing underneath is the very strong authoritarian side to the regime that's coming out in its full colors right now. And the way that we're looking at this and what we're seeing about this is that, and you have to ask yourself, well, how is it that we as a free society don't fall into the same trap? And I think it goes up to the very top in the Kremlin. And I'm reminded of a quote that's attributed to one of Putin's henchmen. And he's a fellow by the name of Medinsky, and he used to be the minister of culture. And woe betide us all, the same guy today is on the Russian delegation that's negotiating with the Ukrainians. So what he said is that truth is what's beneficial to Russia. And by Russia, he means the Kremlin, and he also means Putin.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing is the distortion on that side already is that the truth is what they say that it is, and they expect everybody to swallow that. And so what is truth by their standard in this conflict? In true Orwellian fashion, the truth is what's happening in Ukraine isn't a war. It's a special military operation. The truth is, according to them, the Ukrainian government wasn't freely elected. No, they're a bunch of neo-Nazis who are terrorizing the Russian-loving people of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the muzzle on the Russian opposition is being cinched ever tighter. What we're seeing is that anyone who dares to protest against the war is being arrested or driven into exile. Young Russians are also protesting with their feet. They're leaving the country in droves. Tens of thousands of them are leaving the country even though they have no means of getting the money because their credit cards have all been canceled, and so they're pitching up in places like Istanbul and Tbilisi and all around Europe, and I'm sure many of them are trying to reach the shores of the United States. And the independent news media has been censored or shut down. Its journalists are threatened with 15 years in prison. And even still, what we're seeing is that there are very few acts of brave defiance. I'm sure you all saw the TV producer who held up a no-war protest sign, right during the middle of a national news broadcast. And she was immediately arrested and fined, and it looks like she was interrogated for 18 hours, and then she's been released for now. We'll see how long that lasts. But I think we have to assume that with social media cut off, that most Russians are either indifferent to what's going on in Ukraine or are swallowing Putin's nationalistic propaganda. As the Kremlin is finding out, though, that when there's a news vacuum, that rumors run riot. And I think that's what happens, that rumors that ordinarily wouldn't have any currency at all because there's nothing to counteract them, that they gain a currency of their own and a credibility that can't be controlled by the state apparatus. And so what we're seeing is all sorts of juicy stories which may or may not be true. How Putin has sacked his generals and placed his intelligence chiefs under house arrest. And there was another good one, that the Russians were so certain that the invasion would be a catwalk that the soldiers were ordered to take their dress uniforms for a victory parade in Kiev. So we all saw how well that's worked out. No need for their dress uniforms. And on the other hand, let's look at the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have been gloriously adept at using social media, and they've done so to unite the Ukrainian people behind them. Zelensky wasn't a particularly popular president before all this happened. And then now he's really seized the reins of the country, and the Ukrainians have taken him as their leader and their hero. And I think the rest of the world has too. I think he alone has done an awful lot to kind of further the broad international support that we're seeing for the Ukrainian fight against the Russian invaders. But I think we should sort of pause and examine, why is it that we're all in favor of Ukraine? Well, first of all, their country's being invaded. Second of all, they're the plucky little underdogs, and because they're the plucky little underdogs, we desperately want them to prevail. We want them to get their country back. We want them to be left alone. We want all these people who were more concerned about, shopping for dinner and doing all the normal things that we do, and then next thing you know, the Russians have invaded, and their lives have been scattered, and they've been scattered, and the men are fighting for the country, and the women have had to leave to other countries. But this puts us in journalists in a very difficult situation, because in some ways our heart naturally goes out to the Ukrainians. But at that moment, I think, that we still have to be careful that war is war. And what happens in war is that when one side commits acts of unspeakable barbarity, as we see the Russians doing, pounding the country day after day. But when we're witness to such acts of unspeakable barbarity, it's very difficult for the other side to resist doing exactly the same. But what are we hearing? Here in the States, well, all we're hearing is the side of the plucky Russians and how they're holding out against this indomitable Russian siege that's going on. And I have to wonder, as a journalist looking at the situation before all of the fighting started, that we had the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians had a national identity, that was true, but they were intertwined as people. There were families, Ukrainian families that live in Russia, Russian families that live in Ukraine. There was intermarriage. And you look at the statistics in some ways to see how many of the Ukrainians have fled their country and where they've gone to. And it's up to 3 million now, so the vast majority of them have fled to Europe. But now I think it's up to 150,000 of them have fled to Russia. So I think one question that I would ask as a journalist is in a situation like that, and I remember in the early days of before Russia actually invaded, that the Ukrainians were saying, everybody must be vigilant because the Russians have spies. They have people who are going around and they're marking with phosphorescent stripes possible targets for the bombers. And things like that, it's very easy in a situation, especially when you've seen your apartment buildings bombed, your hospitals, people taken hostage by the Russians. It's very hard not to respond in kind. And we don't hear about that. And I think we owe it to ourselves as people who consume information and who look and try to see both sides of things, that this is a war that's going on. There are soldiers who are being killed in the thousands by both sides, and we can seize on those optimistic moments of a young Ukrainian girl singing in a bomb shelter, and how we all felt. I don't know how many of you saw it, but it went viral on the internet, and it's hard not to have your heart stirred by moments like that. But we have to remember at the same time that there's the fierce battles being waged, and men on both sides are dying, and war is savagery, and things happen on both sides. So I think it's important that we examine in some ways not only the horrible things that the Russians are committing against the Ukrainians, but what the Ukrainians have had to do in their self-defense. And I've seen that in situations like that, that as much as we want, the Ukrainians to kick the Russians out of their country, it's the duty of the press and us as consumers of information to hold both sides accountable too. We have to keep assessing really what's going on as objectively as we can. And my wife Jan, who's sitting over there, and I have friends who are reporting on the fighting in Ukraine. And I'm wondering how they're doing it, how they can maintain a semblance of objectivity, covering this terrible conflict. That's really one of the agonies that you face of a journalist going into a war zone. And you might ask, why bother with objectivity when there's such a clear distinction between the good guys and the bad guys, as seems to be happening in Ukraine? What do you do? Do you discard objectivity? Do you just say, to hell with it? As soon as you cross the border and suddenly you encounter wave after waves of refugees, of women and children who are pouring across, fleeing the missile strikes and the bombardments of their cities, at that moment, do you abandon your objectivity and say, no, my heart is with these people, I have to write about their struggle, I have to write about their suffering? Well, it's hard not to do that, as a journalist. Your soul would really have to be, made of ice, something like Putin's soul, to be able to do that, to maintain that objectivity. And when you go into these situations as a journalist, you're putting your hands in the lives of the people around you, the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers, the firefighters, the taxi drivers, the people who you're counting on to guide you up to the front lines and to help you to make it back safely so that you can file your stories and you can go back to your wives and the children when this is all over. But it's very difficult to maintain this objectivity because you're riding with these guys, you befriend them, and it's very hard, it's almost impossible not to become partisan, to become very one-sided in your reporting. But for there to be any kind of truth in what you report, I think this tendency has to be resisted, that no matter how hard your heart pulls you in one direction, you should try to see things as clearly as you can through the fog of war. And that's a very difficult thing to do. But I guess I should kind of talk a little bit about how reporters operate in war zones. And in the past few days, we've seen how dangerous it's become. Several Fox News people were killed, one was badly wounded, and another journalist, American filmmaker named Brent Renault, was also killed. And we were discussing this at dinner, that I think it's going to be, I think sadly we're going to be seeing more casualties of the press because we're in a situation, as we see, where the front line is very fluid. It's changing on an hourly basis, on a street by streets. There's fighting going on in what may have been a safe neighborhood or a forest in the morning. Suddenly, by the time that you roll up there with your car and you get out and you've never been in this place before, and suddenly you look around and the Ukrainians made a strategic retreat and you're facing the Russians. And when you're facing the Russians, these are guys who are young conscripts and they've been shot at from all sides. And so they see anything that's moving, and especially a car that would suddenly screech to a halt and turn around, and they're going to open up fire. And I don't know that these killings were deliberate or whether it was the result of shelling because they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it's especially true of as a print journalist, I can interview people who fled back from from the front lines and find out what's going on. But it's really the TV crews and the photographers who have to be there. They have to get the images, and they have to be where the action is. So they're the ones who are really in the direct line of fire. And I don't think the Russians are necessarily going to show any pity to any foreign journalists that they capture, because they consider any journalist who's reporting on the war and presenting the Ukrainian point of view is going to be considered their enemy. So I think it's a very, very dangerous situation that the press is finding themselves in. You know, but the truth is, I think, is if the war were going well for the Russians, if they were truly winning, that they would show us. And we're not seeing any images from the Russian side. I was talking to Tommy, who's a fluent Russian speaker, and he was saying that he would monitor the Russian news, and maybe he's got some information that I haven't heard, but as far as I know, there's only one foreign journalist who's actually reporting from the Russian side, and that's a Chinese journalist. And of course, he's reporting exactly what the Russians want. So, but I think that if the Russians were winning, if they were conquering cities and taking them over, I think that we would see more images of that would be posted on the state news channels of Russia, and we're just not seeing that. So, again, it's the news vacuum, and rumors tend to circulate. And if the Ukrainians say they've killed 3 or 4 Russian generals and shot down dozens of helicopters and planes, that it's very difficult to dispute that. But at the same time, I think we have to take any information that comes out of a war zone with a grain of salt, that both sides are wanting to spin the war to their own side for propaganda uses. And we've seen it with the way the Russians are talking about, well, the Americans and the Ukrainians are conspiring to use, biochemical warfare, and there's no truth to it. And in fact, it may be sort of a false flag that, as Zelensky is saying, is actually, telegraphing the fact that the Russians are intending to do the same thing, and then blaming it on the Americans and the Ukrainians. But we always have to take everything that we read or see with a bit of skepticism. And you're all very intelligent, well-read people, and I'm sure you're doing that already. I'm sure that that when you look at the information every day, as I do, and pour over it with anxiety, and in my heart, I'm cheering when I hear that the Ukrainians have downed a Russian plane or a helicopter, or that they've held off from allowing the Russians to conquer their cities. I want to cheer for them, but at the same time, I have to wonder how much of what the Ukrainians were also saying about the way the war is going is actually true. So if there's one thing that I'd like to get across is, let's all be a bit circumspect about what we're hearing, what we're reading, because things have a tendency to kind of flop the other way. We don't know how this is going to turn out. Hopefully it will be with the retreat of the Russians, and that the Ukrainians will get all of their country back and their borders. But I don't know. I think that in Russia, like I said, I don't know much about the place, but at all. But following what I see is that it seems very unlikely that there's going to be any sort of groundswell of public opinion that's going to lead to Putin pulling back the troops, admitting surrender. Doubt that very much, or even Putin being removed. I think that if that happens, it's probably going to come from the security apparatus or the military, who realize that this thing has gone way too far and it's only going to get worse, and that Putin would somehow be edged out of the picture. But I don't see any indication that that's really happening. And so it's great to hear that there's another round of peace talks that's starting again, and that Zelensky says the Russians are being a bit more realistic about it. But then again, I just get the feeling that that the Russians, both sides, are sort of playing this game too of how long they can both pretend to be wanting peace in the case of the Russians, and how much the Ukrainians are really willing to withstand the complete decimation of their country and the destruction of all of their cities. You know, this is a terrible toll that they have to take. And we're sitting here in comfortable Marin County. We don't have to make these decisions of do we surrender and try to fight a sort of a guerrilla action afterwards, or and then allow our cities to exist in some form, or do we just fight to the very bitter end? I mean, these are terrible existentialistic questions that I hope none of us ever have to go through in firsthand. But all I can say is that the only advice I can give really is to approach what you hear from both sides with a very healthy dose of skepticism. And however much we want the Ukrainians to win, we have to know that they're also desperately trying to put their own spin on things and win over our hearts and minds too. I don't know how many of you drive yourselves crazy scrolling through the news on the internet the way that I do and my wife Jan does. But it's always a good idea to see where the information is coming from, to ask yourself, are the people who are spouting off saying these things, are they really in the position to know what's going on? Or are they just pushing their own political agendas? I mean, we're seeing that very much with the American media and the way that it's being covered by the different cable TV stations and the different commentators that you know, 6 months ago were the resident experts on the COVID virus, and suddenly the same people are spouting off with a great deal of authority on the war in Ukraine, and so please be careful, you know, what people are saying and what your sources of information are. And you know, as we sit here, you know, and we're distant spectators to the tragic events in Ukraine, I think it's up to us, you know, it's our duty to be especially cautious about what we're told is the truth, and even if our hearts are pulling us in one direction. And thank you, that's really all I have to say. And I'd like to open it up to questions, Bill. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. I'd like you to step back for a bit and kind of remind us of what is taking place in this country with the press, the divisions we have with, you know, as I mentioned in my remarks, that there's political polarity in our country, and that is the same. I think they'd like to hear your comments on that as well.
Yeah. Can I give you a bit of history on that? You know, it was, people talk about the mainstream media, and there were probably far simpler times when we didn't have cable TV news stations, when everybody turned to the Walter Cronkites or the TV anchors as sort of a source, as a reliable source of information. And then suddenly we had sort of the end of the fairness doctrine, which meant that it was no longer necessary if you have someone that you're putting on air, who's expressing opinions that are expressing opinions, period. And the idea was that you had to have someone to bring about the opposing points of view. Well, that was pretty much done away with, because it was thought that this was having a chilling effect on the press. And the people who were really behind it were the people who were pushing the whole idea of a 24-hour news channel. And they soon realized that, look, gathering news is expensive. It costs a lot of money to send a correspondent out to cover a war in the Middle East. And what we can do is, we've got 24-hour news cycle to fill. We'll just show the same images over and over, and then we'll get people to come in and give us their opinions. And the opinion is a lot cheaper than sending someone out there to get real information firsthand. And so what we're seeing now is just this proliferation of opinion makers, of people who are just commenting about everything. And at the same time, we're having this proliferation of sources of information. We're not just all going, dipping into the same well for information. We're getting it off the internet, and it's this. It's more than a fire hose that's being blasted at us every time. It's like a tsunami that's hitting us. And so what do? I think it was interesting, and most of my students, I asked them to raise their hands. I said, how many of you, read a newspaper online? Where do you get your information from? And I thought, well, they'd all say the New York Times or the Washington Post. And they all say, well, we get it from social media. We get it what our friends send to each other. And so I think what we're seeing more and more is that people are becoming much more, and I think, this is well documented, that it's the algorithms of social media that drive people towards the websites that have really, that give you the most, what should I say, the most kind of heightened extremist point of views, the things that are most likely not to provoke your thoughts, but to inflame your fear and your anger. And I think that what's happening now is that everybody has their own different, you can call them silos, you can call them funnels, but everybody is faced with this barrage of information that we tend to limit our sources of information to what our friends tell us, what our colleagues tell us. Maybe some of the older, more responsible members of us, still go to a newspaper of record that we trust, or to the BBC, or NPR, or the Wall Street Journal's news is very good. But I think we're finding more and more that what sells, what gets the clicks, what gets the advertisements on the internet, it isn't sort of the well-rationed analytical pieces that appear, that eloquently argue sort of the merits of both sides. What people go for is just kind of to get their fix of anger and fear. And I think that's making us as a people, as a nation, kind of far more anxious about what's happening in the world. Plus, we're dialed in instantly to anything and everything, and it touches us. Events that are far away touch us in a much more visceral way than they ever have before. So that when we see the little girl singing her heartbreakingly beautiful song in a bunker in Ukraine, that how can we not respond to that in a way that makes us angry with what the Russians are doing? And again, I think it's ways that the only way to break out of this, I think, is for everybody to take a step back, disconnect a little bit, try not to be, I find this especially difficult for myself, try not to be obsessed by the news, try to just take a step back and think about other things, and then think about, why am I getting so angry about this? What does it really affect me in a personal way? And try to see that other people are probably just as scared and as anxious as you are, but from a different point of view. And you can argue the merits of whatever it is that sets us apart. And there are so many things that if you look for divisions in our society, you can find them. But I think the basis, we all have members of our families who are of a different political persuasion, and we may shout at them and feel vexed and angry at them. But at the same time, we got to live with them. You know, we have to deal with them, and I think we have to return to, I think, a time of greater public civility, and yeah, that would be nice. That would be nice.